For the first time in what feels like forever, we received some new information about the upcoming 2024 Dungeons & Dragons Core Rulebooks, and it comes to us from an article in Game Informer magazine of all places. Though we didn't get an immense amount of specifics, we were treated to a good amount of new information about all three Core Rulebooks: the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monster Manual. So I wanted to go over and discuss some of the implications I think it will have on the revision to the game, and some of the things that have me most excited. We're going to start with something that stood out to me, but isn't actually new information, but rather something of a first impression by the author, which is to say that after spending the day with the books and the design team, it feels very clear to him that this revision is much more than just window dressing and a repackaging of pre-existing content. This is a big deal. There has been a lot of talk and questioning over the last year or so during the Unearthed Arcana phase about how much is actually going to be new, and that many people just feel like this is Wizards of the Coast trying to sell them the same books again. For clarity, that is not a view that I share, but it is nice to see that my perspective is being reinforced by someone who has had the opportunity to look at all three books in more detail than anyone so far outside of WotC. You can decide for yourself whether you think the view is biased or not, given that they had exclusive early access. I'm gonna take the claim at face value based on many of the details that were revealed in the article, and given that, it's nice to know that our money isn't going to just buy a lightly retouched version of the same game from 10 years ago, but rather a much more meaningful and intentional update where everything went back under review. That's not to say that everyone is going to like everything about it, because they won't, but it's good to see that so much care was taken. Alright, so what's new? Let's start with the Player's Handbook. Hey, what are the odds? I am also currently on a quest to hit 10,000 subscribers by the time that the 2024 PHB releases in September. So if you want to help support me, a sub to the channel would mean a lot. It's one click for you and it does a lot for me. Also, shout out to my members, Julian in the Champion tier, Jackal3 and Jumpy Sonic Bear in the Hero tier, and Julio, SirenXY, Brainlaborx, Nathan, and D&D Unoptimized in the Warrior tier. Your support helps me a lot, so thank you. The first thing that we learned is that the 2024 Player's Handbook will feature 75 feats. This is also a big deal. For context, the 2014 PHB had, by my count at least, 41 feats. This is nearly double that amount. For even more context, I counted 108 feats in the game in total, but that is spread out over the course of dozens and dozens of adventures and campaign settings and rule supplements over the course of a decade. So the fact that we're getting 75 just in the Player's Handbook alone represents a massive jump in available content for players. This is especially true if you consider new players, though it is something of a double-edged sword. New players without a massive repository of books will get to massively benefit from the sheer number of options available to them without having to purchase any additional books. This is great and helps to demonstrate some good value for money. On the other hand though, it can potentially at least be overwhelming to have tons and tons of content to sift through when you don't really know what you're looking for. However, given that we know that feats are getting some level classifications, the amount of available feats will then be segmented, helping to make that choice easier. This speaks to the fact that the designers are really working hard to give more options, but simultaneously making it easier to pick the right ones. It will be very interesting to see which of the feats are carried over from different books, which have been tweaked, and which will be brand new. I suspect that there will be a good mix of all three categories, and I look forward to being able to dive in and find out. When it comes to backgrounds, we received confirmation that the book will contain 16 to choose from. This is the same number that we saw in the 2014 book, but it is worth mentioning that backgrounds have been completely revised in the 2024 editions. One of the most notable things is that it's your background now that determines your ability score bonuses, not race anymore, which is now known as species. Though we found out during the Unearthed Arcana process that backgrounds would be determining ability score bonuses, as it was still playtest material, it wasn't confirmed, but now it has been. As for spells, though we don't get any solid numbers, we do know that the book will feature a revised version of old spells, some spells from other books, as well as a bevy of new spells to choose from. The other major revision that we see in the Player's Handbook is probably less flashy than spells and feats, but I think is critical to the smoother flow of the game and is a massive quality of life change. And that is a complete restructure of the chapters in the book. No longer does the PHB just launch straight into character creation. Instead, it begins with a chapter dedicated to playing the game. It contains footnotes and examples and references and an included rules glossary that covers all sorts of various rules that might come up, from jumping to cover to being prone and anything else that might have been hard to find in the past. Again, I know that this isn't all that flashy, but I can't emphasize enough how happy this makes me. There are so many times where you'd have to dig through the book to find that one thing that was mentioned in a seemingly unrelated chapter and it's stuck in a sidebar or something. It happens way more than it should. What's nice to see is that the design team isn't just focusing on updating and revising rules and being done with it, but rather they are giving genuine consideration to the experience at the table. They are evaluating common pain points of players and DMs alike and providing ways of addressing them in simple but effective ways. This holistic attention to detail to the overall experience is an encouraging element of the process that I am happy to see, as it helps underscore the point from the beginning, which is to say that this is much more than just a repacking of old content. The equipment section of the book is also getting an overhaul. Not only will it feature much improved art to better help show off the differences between the various weapons in the game, but it will also include a new section for tools that includes actions for each one, as well as expanded rules for item crafting, including for spell scrolls and potions of healing. These are all areas where the game has seriously lacked over the last 10 years. Yeah, there have been smatterings of rules here and there for using tools, including in Xanathar's Guide to Everything, and rules for crafting things like spell scrolls have also existed in the past, but it sounds like, and I hope we are at least, getting a lot more than just a reprint of those rules, but rather something of a reimagining of them, to make them more robust and useful without simultaneously breaking the game. A difficult balance to be sure, but a welcome one. We also learned that there's going to be a new appendix that goes into more detail about the multiverse and much more to embrace that 5th edition and D&D more broadly is about so much more than just the Forgotten Realms. What has me very excited about the 2024 Player's Handbook is that it seems like it's going to be taking all the best parts of the game that have made their way into it since it was released and incorporating them into one book. It can be so easy to look at this as a pure cash grab, and even I have been pretty skeptical in the past, but the more that I'm seeing and reading about it, the more value I see this book actually bringing. In a lot of ways, it feels like you're getting the best of the Player's Handbook, Xanathar's, and Tasha's all in one book, and then you're getting a ton of new stuff on top of revised and improved versions of the old stuff, not just reprints. When it comes to the Dungeon Master's Guide, I am equally happy to hear that it is getting the attention that it deserves. I've mentioned on this channel before how it's a book that I've always wanted to love, but always found it such a challenging book to functionally use. The layout is all over the place, and it's a much more egregious offender when it comes to the very useful rules or mechanics being buried away in random sidebars in unrelated chapters than even the PHB was. But it sounds like the DMG is getting a lot of love. It's still going to be loaded with magic items, though no specific number was given. However, much of the goal this time is on showing rather than telling. They're going to be providing half-page sample adventures to help guide new DMs to creating hooks and worlds. They're going to be providing sample maps that include monsters and trap locations to give a solid understanding of how these things all work together to make for a great adventure. The two things that have me the most excited are the encounter designer and guidelines for buying and making magic items. Starting with encounter design, yeah, the 2014 DMG and Xanathar's does include some advice on this, but it's not great. Don't get me wrong, it works, but the biggest whiff is really just that the challenge rating system is quite off on so many creatures in the game. I'm hoping to see a much more methodical and built-out encounter designer that also includes advice and tips on dynamically scaling monsters to adjust to an appropriate challenge. I know that when I was new to DMing, if I had an encounter built out, but then say one of my players couldn't make the session, I always stressed about the balance of that encounter. It would be great to see a scenario like that, which I am sure is very common, get properly addressed in the book. Then on buying and making magic items, I kinda can't believe that this is actually going to be included in the book. This has been something that we have been asking for in the game for years, and we are finally getting it. Well, hopefully. We don't have many, if any, details on exactly what this looks like, but I also can't imagine that there's that many ways you can interpret guidance on buying and making magic items. Perhaps we will see the long-fabled price list, or even if there isn't, something a bit more specific than the incredibly wide ranges that the current DMG offers would go a really long way. On making magic items, I hope that we do get a true crafting system. This has been something that has been asked for forever, and there are countless homebrew versions of it, but it would be so cool to have a fleshed out and detailed system built right into the core books. The new Dungeon Master's Guide will also feature a detailed lore glossary to help DMs learn the names and history that the game has built out over the last 5 decades. I am something of a lore junkie, so I am very excited to see this. The book will also be fleshing out the world of Greyhawk, a setting that has seen precious little attention since the release of 5e, so it's nice to see a bit more being paid to settings that exist outside of the Forgotten Realms. Lastly, the Monster Manual. We already knew that this was going to be the biggest monster manual the game has ever seen, but now we know it's going to be including over 500 monsters in it, and 75 of which that will be brand new. This is massive. The original 5e monster manual had roughly 300-ish creatures in it, so this is quite a significant jump in quantity. But what's more interesting to me than the quantity is the apparent quality. At least according to this article, no monster stat block has gone untouched. This, to me at least, might be the biggest deal so far. While there's a lot of monsters in the game, many feel very similar to run and fight against. Many don't hit their challenge ratings and others are just straight up busted. Knowing that the team took the time to revise every single stat block for the new monster manual to hopefully ensure that they all feel and run just the way you would expect them to is a big win for players and DMs. Another awesome inclusion is the expansion of monster families for certain creatures. If you think about something like a dragon, you probably know that they come in a wide variety of ages and challenge ratings, from the wormling to young dragons to adult dragons to ancient dragons and even all the way to great worms. This is the concept of monster families that they're going to be expanding out to additional creatures. Part of the reason why this is a helpful thing to do is that there's often creatures that have a very narrow band of relevance in a campaign, assuming you aren't modifying them. They use the example of a vampire, which is a creature that will destroy you if you encountered it early, but is kind of a joke if you fight them a little bit later on. There's a fairly narrow level band where they pose an appropriate threat. But this is something that is not just unique to vampires, but to many creatures in the game. By expanding monster families out, they can allow for many more types of creatures to be played across many more levels, which is so exciting. One more thing in the monster manual are the addition of new, what Jeremy Crawford describes as Titan monsters. One of which is the Blob of Annihilation, which is essentially a gigantic gelatinous ooze that can absorb entire towns. Or the Elemental Juggernaut that can crush a building with a single step. Despite the fact that very few players will ever get to directly interact with a monster of this magnitude, I think it's so important that they are creating them. Firstly, they almost write an adventure hook on their own, which is pretty convenient, but they also create this shared knowledge or dread amongst the table in much the same way as many groups talk about the Tarrasque, which is a fun element of meta world building even. On top of all these things, the books are going to be absolutely packed with art. 60 pieces of art in the character classes section alone. One for each of the 12 classes, and then another one for each of the 48 subclasses. Each book is also going to be pushing 400 pages, which feels good. One final piece of information we received, or at least that I got, maybe it was out already, I'm not sure, but pre-orders for the 2024 PHB will begin on June 18th. Overall, I'm honestly more excited than I ever have been before to see what the 2024 revised books have to offer. I'm really curious to hear what you all think too, so be sure to let me know in the comments. Check out some of my other D&D videos, but otherwise, take care.